Welcome to the Forensic Financialist, where we simplify business and leadership challenges and choose the road that leads to wisdom and excellence. We discuss tough issues facing business and figure out easy-to-implement solutions. Using the rear-view mirror approach, we look in the rear view to move towards a brighter future. Here's your host, Jeff Newkirk.
Welcome to the Forensic Financialist. I'm your host, Jeff Newkirk. Well, I can't believe it, but this is the 21st episode of the Forensic Financialist. Wow. You know, if you would have asked me 2 years ago if I would ever do a podcast, I'd be like, I don't think so. That's just not in my skill set. But I don't know if it is yet. But man, I really, really enjoy doing this podcast. And I hope that you, the listener, that you're getting something out of it. And I've always said my purpose is to inform and inspire, and that you got to get at least one nugget, one useful piece of information out of each podcast. So I hope that that's been achieved, and this episode will be no different. I want you to get at least one nugget, and get inspired along the way. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm glad that you did. And I'm so appreciative that you did a search for the Forensic Financialist or Jeff Newkirk, however you got here. Thank you. You know, and I have had a number of great guests on this podcast. And I just want to take a minute to thank them for taking the time to talk with me on this podcast. There have been some very inspirational stories. Many have overcome great challenges and have persevered and have experienced tremendous success. And I hope when you listen to those interviews that you got inspired as well. So thank you for guests for participating in my podcast. And thank you listeners for tuning me in. I'm so appreciative. Well, it's February now, and we made it through January. And for some, January was a great month, exceeded expectations. But for many, January was pretty challenging. And I'm talking about financially. So if you're a business owner or an organizational leader in a big multinational organization, or you're just managing your own personal finances, there are some numbers that you need to be aware of. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Knowing your numbers. Now, just saying that, I know some of you are like, oh my God, numbers, no, and you get all stressed out and lots of anxiety. But no, it's okay. You know, we're talking about your business, your financial situation, and we're going to simplify. We're not going to make it complicated. So stick with me. But before we get into the numbers, let's talk about an inspiring story that I read out of Chicago. Now, Chicago is close to my heart. I grew up there. I have many friends that still live in Chicago. And if you've watched the news, read the news, listened to the news, you know that Chicago's received some pretty negative press lately. But the story that I read was just incredibly heartwarming, and it reminds us that there are good people in the world. Lots of good people. We just hear about all the bad. So this past week in Chicago, the weather sucked. I mean, let's be honest. It's like minus lots of degrees with snow and just crazy, brutal winter. Well, Mr. Robert Magier, and Robert, I apologize. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name, but he's a restaurant owner in Chicago. And on his way to work early one morning last week, he saw a street vendor. And that street vendor was bundled up, multiple layers of clothing. Remember, it was like minus a zillion. And he stopped and saw that the street vendor was selling tamales. And he said, yeah, I'm going to buy all of your tamales. And by the way, whatever I owe you, I'm going to give you a huge tip too. So I want you to get out of the cold, go home and warm up. And he didn't stop there. He did that every day. Every day he looked for street vendors, bought all of their tamales, and gave them a chance to go home and warm up. And what did he do? What did Robert do with all those tamales? Well, he gave them to the homeless who were hungry and cold themselves. So Robert, he helped the street vendors by buying all of their product, and in the process was able to feed lots of homeless people who were in desperate need. So Robert, thank you. Thank you for what you do. You're inspiring. We need more people like you, for sure. Lots more. And listeners, when you hear that story, I hope you feel like you can do the same, because you can. We can all make a difference. Okay, now let's talk numbers. We are in February. We are done with January, and it's time to do the review. Now, I use the RVM methodology. Now, if you've listened to previous episodes, you know that the RVM stands for Rear View Mirror Approach. That's rear view mirror approach. Review, R. E is examine. A, adjust. R, revise. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to review and we're going to examine. And what are we going to review and examine? We're going to look at 4 critical financial measures. Now, don't get all stressed out. We're going to be super simple about this. I know we're talking numbers, and it's okay. Don't get stressed and all anxious. It'll be all right. So whether you're a business owner, you're working in a large organization, or you're just managing your own personal finances, you got to know your numbers. You got to know where you stand financially. First, gross revenues. How was last month? How did you do in January? Were your sales on track? Did you sell more or less than expected? And when you're looking at sales, you gotta know not just the dollar amount, but the quantity. How many transactions? How many products did you sell? How many services did you provide? What made up that gross revenue number? Expenses. What were your total expenses for January? Were they more or less than what you expected? Now, I hope you have a budget, and I hope as you're doing this review, you can compare the actual outcome to your budget. And if you don't have a budget, it's not too late. It's never too late to have a budget. Set up a budget now so you know what the end of the year could potentially be like. And every month we'll do the review. Every month we'll do the examination. And you can tweak, adjust what needs to be adjusted. But you've got to know where you stand, and you've got to be able to plan for what the year could look like. And that starts with having a plan, and in that plan, a budget. Budget. Now, expenses. If you're in Chicago, for example, we talked about the brutal winter in Chicago, and having lived there many, many years, it can get, just like it is this week, incredibly cold. And what happens when it's incredibly cold? Well, you got to turn up the heat. What happens when you turn up the heat in your house or apartment? Well, your utility expenses increase dramatically. So probably in February, because it's so cold there now, utility bills are going to be high. Did that happen in January? Or was there another expense item that was higher than expected? The only way you're going to know is you've got to look at your total expenses and then look at the detail. Why were your total expenses the way they were? Examine some of that detail. Okay, profitability, the difference between gross revenues and expenses. That's your savings if you're looking at it from a personal perspective. From a business perspective, that's your net income. So what was left over? I hope it was a lot more than what you thought. But if not, why not? What happened to create the difference? Now, when you go through the gross revenues analysis or examination and you examine your total expenses, I hope you can see why the outcome was the way it was for January. But you're not going to know unless you do the review and the examination. So let's take an example, really to drive this point home. We got two different clients, Client A and Client B. Client A had gross revenues of $50,000. Client B had gross revenues of $25,000. Now, right away, you're going to say that Client A did much better. Well, that's true. Okay, 50,000 versus 25,000 gross. That's true. Expenses for Client A were $25,000. Expenses for Client B were $15,000. So Client A had a net of $25,000. So their gross revenue is 50, their total expense is 25, and their net's the difference at 25,000. Client B had gross revenues of 25,000, expenses of 15,000, and a net, the difference of 10,000. Now stick with me. That's the review. We just did the review of high-level profitability of Client A, Client B. Client A, half of what they sold, they realized in profit. So they sold 50,000, their profitability was 25,000. A little less than half for Client B, their gross was 25,000 and their net was 10,000. Now let's look at why they had the bottom line that they did. In Client B, we'll take Client B first. Client B had 25 total transactions. So each one averaged $1,000. Now, not all right on $1,000, some more, some less, but 25 transactions at $1,000 each. So was that expected? Yes, it was expected. Pretty close to what was expected. No surprises. For Client A, they had 10 transactions or 10 total sales. The average then, 5,000 each. So they had gross of 50,000, 10 sales, average of 5,000. But here's where it gets interesting. One sale for Client A was $25,000. So in other words, half of what they grossed, half of their gross revenue in the month of January was because of one sale. One sale. You take out that sale, and what's their gross? $25,000. What were their total expenses? $25,000. What would be their profitability? 0. So they had one sale that gave them basically their total profit. So what's my point here? My point is Client A needs to understand that that may not happen every single month, and we need to plan or adjust expenses for the rest of the year in case we don't, or they don't have that one super incredible transaction, that one sale that really put them over the top. Now, they may, which would be awesome, but you can't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. So they need to really look at the detail and understand what gave them that one sale. If they can repeat it, great, but don't put all your eggs in one basket, because if it doesn't occur, remember, that one transaction didn't happen, they'd have no profitability. So that's the point I wanted to make. Do the review, know your numbers, gross revenue, expenses, your net, and know why. That's the examination step. The fourth measure I want to talk about is your cash balance. Now, why is this so important? Well, what happened last year with the pandemic in March? We were told that businesses had to shut down. What happens if your business has to shut down? In other words, if you can't make one sale, you can't sell one product, you can't provide one service, so your gross revenues are zero. Could that happen again? I hope not, but it did happen. We weren't prepared for that. Who was prepared for that? Nobody. That would be impossible to prepare for something like that. Well, now we know it can happen. So if we're not prepared now, shame on us. Here's my point. You've got to have enough cash on hand that if you had no more sales, you would be able to pay for all of your expenses for at least 3 months. Now, some may say 6 months. I'm going to say 3. If you can have enough cash, on hand to pay for your expenses for 6 months without making one sale, kudos. I mean, that's awesome. But let's get to at least 3 months. So first of all, what is your cash balance? Do you know how much cash you have on hand? And how does that compare to your expenses? Do you have enough cash to pay for all of those expenses? You need to know that, and you need to prepare, because if you don't have enough cash, then it's time to make some adjustments. And those adjustments can be looking at your expenses, adjusting what you can. Do it strategically. Don't just start cutting to cut, because you will make cuts that don't make sense for the business. They've got to be strategic. So just a quick review. You got to know your gross revenues. You got to know your expenses. You got to know your profitability. You got to know some of the whys behind the occurrence. Remember, client A versus client B. Client A had one huge transaction that provided all of their profitability, which was awesome, but you've got to plan for that potentially not to occur. Meaning, make sure that you know your numbers, examine the detail, adjust what you need, and revise your future outcomes. Client A needs to know that that one transaction may not happen every month, and plan accordingly. And cash balance. You got to have enough cash on hand to pay for at least 3 months worth of expenses should no sales occur. Well, I hope this made sense. I hope I didn't stress you out. I know some people get a little stressed with numbers, but it's okay. It's okay. You just got to know your numbers, know where you're at, so you can make some good decisions that are in the best interest of your business. Before I close out, I'm going to ask you to do 3 things. First, I want you to take a minute and be thankful for all that you have. We have so much to be thankful for. We are in abundance in this country. And we don't always realize it because we hear of all the negative stuff on the news. But be thankful. Be thankful for the basics. The roof over your head, food on the table, shirt on your back. Remember that. Lots to be thankful for. Number 2, reach out to somebody that either you haven't connected with yet or you haven't talked with in a long time. You'd be surprised how much that's going to mean to that person. And number 3, please, please, please go through the RVM. Use that rear view method that I've been talking about. You've got to know where your business is right now, where your personal financial situation is right now, so you can plan for a successful 2021. It can be a great year. I have every intention of making 2021 an awesome, awesome year, but it's not going to happen by happenstance. It's going to happen because we're planning for it. Okay, that's it. Hope it was a great episode for you, and I hope today was a great day for you, and I hope tomorrow is even better. Peace, everyone.
You've been listening to The Forensic Financialist, where we simplify business and leadership challenges and choose the road that leads to wisdom and excellence. To learn more about Jeff, visit his website at understandablesolutions.com or email Jeff at jeff@understandablesolutions.com. Mentioning this podcast will get you a complimentary discovery session with Jeff. Until next time.